This is Mr. H. You're listening to Masked Horror. The Haunted Rental. Emily. I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right about this house. It started off so perfectly. Matt and I were thrilled when we found it. The price was almost too good to be true, especially for such a charming, older home in a quiet neighborhood. The landlord, Mr. Adams, seemed like a genuinely nice guy. He was in his 60s, with a kind smile and a grandfatherly vibe. He mentioned that he lived nearby and was always available if we needed anything. At the time, I appreciated the offer. Now, I'm not so sure. The first few nights in the house were fine. We unpacked, settled in, and started making plans for our future, finding our dream home, starting a family. But then, about a week in, I started hearing things. It was subtle at first, just the creaking of floorboards or the faint sound of something brushing against the walls. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe just the age of the place. But then the whisper started. It would happen late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. I'd hear faint murmurs, as if someone was speaking, just outside the bedroom door. I'd nudge Matt awake, but by the time he came to, the noises had stopped. He'd reassure me it was just my imagination, probably a result of being in a new place, and eventually I'd drift back to sleep. But the sounds persisted. One night, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps that seemed to move from the hallway to the living room. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. I was certain someone was in the house. I woke Matt, and we both crept downstairs, armed with a baseball bat, but there was no one there. The doors were locked, and the windows were shut tight. Matt double-checked everything, but I could tell he was starting to get concerned too. He didn't say anything, but the way he hesitated before going back to bed told me he was on edge. Then things started moving. It was small things at first, my keys not being where I left them, a book on the coffee table ending up on the floor, the TV remote placed neatly on the armchair when I was sure I'd left it on the sofa. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being forgetful, but deep down, I knew something was off. The worst was when I found a photo of Matt and I from our wedding day, which had always been in our bedroom, tucked under a cushion in the living room. I hadn't put it there, and when I asked Matt, he had no idea how it got there either. The final straw came when Matt had to go out of town for a few days on business. I was nervous about being alone, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a house, after all. But that night, as I lay in bed, the sounds returned, only this time they were louder. Footsteps creaked down the hall, stopping just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, the door handle rattled. I shot out of bed and grabbed my phone, dialing Matt, but it went straight to voicemail. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to decide whether to flee the house or investigate. After what felt like hours, I mustered the courage to get up. The house was dead silent. I crept through each room, finding nothing out of place, but when I reached the attic door, something compelled me to open it. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes left by previous tenants. As I moved further in, I noticed something odd. A section of the wall didn't match the rest. It looked newer, like it had been added later. My hands trembled as I pushed against it, and to my horror, the wall gave way, revealing a hidden crawl space. Inside was a small, windowless room, barely big enough to stand in. The air was stale and thick, with the scent of mildew. My eyes fell on a worn mattress on the floor, covered in a thin blanket. There were piles of old clothing, shoes, and other personal items, things that didn't belong to us. But the worst part was the stack of journals piled in the corner. I picked one up, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat, almost obsessive in its precision. The entries described in disturbing detail the daily lives of the people who had lived in the house before us. It took a moment to sink in, but then I realized with a cold dread what I was reading. This was Mr. Adams' journal. He had been living in the walls of the house, spying on his tenants for years. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to get out, to call the police, to do something, anything. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound of someone breathing, close, too close. I spun around, and there, in the doorway, stood Mr. Adams. He didn't say a word. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as he stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the full horror of what had been happening. This man had been living in our house, watching us, manipulating us, feeding off our fear. I don't remember how I got out of the attic or how I made it to the front door, but the next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air as I called the police. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched the house, Mr. Adams was gone. The police found his journals, his makeshift room in the walls, but there was no sign of him. It's been months since that night, and I still have nightmares. We moved out of that house immediately, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next victims. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow makes my heart race, and I can't help but wonder if he's found someone else to torment. The Last Hike, Jason M. I still can't shake the feeling that something terrible happened to my best friend Mark. It's been months since he disappeared, but the memory of that weekend still haunts me. Mark was one of those guys who lived for the outdoors. He'd always be planning his next hike, talking about some trail he'd read about, or reminiscing about the trips he used to take with his dad. When he mentioned the remote trail up in the mountains, I could see the excitement in his eyes. He'd been wanting to explore it for years, and finally, the opportunity had come. The trail had a reputation, though. Mark knew that. It wasn't just for its beauty, but also for its dark history. Over the past few decades, a handful of hikers had vanished there without a trace. No bodies were ever found, no clues left behind, just gone. But Mark was undeterred. He was confident in his skills and had hiked through tougher terrain before. So early that Saturday morning, he packed up his gear, grabbed his old disposable camera, something his dad had always used on their hikes, and headed out. He told us he'd be back by Sunday evening. When we didn't hear from him, we weren't immediately worried. It wasn't unusual for Mark to lose track of time in the wilderness. But when Monday came and there was still no word, we started to get anxious. By Tuesday, we were in full panic mode and called the authorities. A search party was organized, and we headed up to the trailhead where Mark had left his car. His car was still there, parked neatly where he'd left it, but that was the only sign of him. The search team combed the trail, the surrounding woods, even the nearby creeks and ravines, but there was no trace of Mark. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding him alive faded. But then, just when we were starting to accept the worst, something strange happened. I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a disposable camera, one of those old school ones you have to get developed. I knew instantly that it was Mark's. He'd taken it with him on the hike to honor his father, who had first given him his love for hiking and photography. I couldn't bring myself to touch it at first, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I took the camera to a place that still develops film, and a few days later, I got the photos back. The first few were typical Mark, shots of the trail, the trees, a few selfies with that goofy grin of his. But as I flipped through the photos, they started to change. In one, Mark looked over his shoulder as if he had heard something. In another, his smile was gone, replaced with a look of confusion, maybe even fear. And then, In the background of one of the photos, I saw it. A shadowy figure, just barely visible among the trees. It was hard to make out, but there was definitely something there. The next few photos showed Mark looking increasingly distressed, as if he knew something was wrong. The last photo was the worst. Mark's face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide and wild, as he pointed the camera at something just out of frame. Whatever it was, I'll never know, because that was the final image. The police were baffled when I showed them the photos. They sent out another search party, but again, nothing was found. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an empty trail and endless questions. Months have passed since then, and I can't get those photos out of my mind. Mark is still out there somewhere, lost in those mountains, but I'm starting to believe he wasn't alone. There's something in those woods, something that's been there for years, maybe centuries, taking people who wander too far off the trail. I'm not the only one who thinks so. Just a few weeks ago, another hiker went missing in the same area. And yesterday, I received another package in the mail. Inside was a disposable camera, just like before. I haven't developed the film yet. I'm not sure I want to know what's on it, but I have a feeling I already do.